Hello, I'm Jenna. I'm the consultant clinical psychologist in Salford Learning Disability Team, and in part 2 I'm going to be talking about what is included in the bereavement workbook. You might find it useful to have the workbook printed in front of you whilst you watch the video. What does the workbook include? There are sections for the life cycle, what happens when people die, emotions, the body, and what thoughts people have when someone dies, the time it takes to grieve, how people grieve, beliefs, and other phrases for death. Each section can be completed at different times. You might choose to do 1 or 2 sections and then come back to it. It makes most sense to follow the workbook in the order that it is presented. In the first section, we look at the life cycle. Here you can support the person to think about what happens at each stage of life. For example, you might talk about a person's first word as a baby, a child's first day of school, an adult's first job, and when a person reaches retirement. To relate this task to real life, we would like you to help the person find photos of them at different ages if you can, and also talk about different people they know that are at each different stage of the life cycle. For example, a young niece or nephew at the child stage, a grandparent at the late stage. In this next section, we cover what happens when people die. First off, we start by explaining how people can die at different stages of life, and how some people can die quickly and others die slowly and in different ways. We then move on to explaining what happens to people's bodies when they die, and how they stop breathing, stop eating, and stop doing the things they were doing in everyday life. This section focuses on the education around death that a lot of people with learning disabilities don't fully understand. Understanding the concept of death can make it easier for a person with a learning disability to process the loss. Emotions, bodily reactions, and thoughts. We start this section by asking you to support the person to talk about anyone they know who has died, and if they can remember how this made them feel. After this, we talk about how people can feel angry, sad, lonely, tired, and all sorts of other emotions following someone's death, and how this is a completely normal part of the process of grief. For the next activity, we ask you to support the person to think about how their bodies might respond when they find out someone has died. For example, you might talk about some people getting headaches, feeling numb or tired, getting sweaty, or not being able to stand up. With the person, think about how your body can change over time in response as well. For example, does sleeping get easier as time goes on? As well as emotions and bodily sensations, we also talk in this section about thoughts. To help with understanding what a thought is, we have first included a game where we ask you and the person you are supporting to guess what colour each other is thinking of. Understanding the concept of a thought can be difficult for some people with learning disabilities, so this colour game is aimed to help with this. After that, we have included an activity for you to support the person to think about what thoughts they had or might have when someone they know dies. And we have included a list of common thoughts that people have when someone dies, such as questioning why them and why it has happened. In this section, we talk about how the length of time to grieve isn't set, and that for different people it might take a day, a week, a month, a year or more. We also explain that whilst the person might feel okay one day, they might not feel okay the next day. It's important for people with learning disabilities to know that there is no right or wrong amount of time to feel okay. For a lot of people, it's also common to feel more emotional on certain days, such as the person's birthday or around Christmas, or when they have reminders of the person, such as when they hear a certain song or smell a certain smell. To think about what occasions and memories are important for the person you support, we have included an activity for you to discuss this with them. Lastly, in this section, we explain how different each death can be and how this might be affected by how well you know a person and whether you knew the person was dying. For example, the death of someone's friend might feel very differently to them from the death of a celebrity. In this section, we discuss the different ways people cope with losing someone. We start this section by explaining what a funeral is and what happens at a funeral. We also talk about how some people choose to be buried and some people choose to be cremated and what these mean. We would like you to support the person to think about any funerals they've been to before and what the experience was like for them. We also want to make sure people with learning disabilities are given choices over their deaths, and so we've briefly included some questions on what they would like for their funeral when they die. As well as funerals, we talk about other ways of coping in this section, such as making memory boxes and looking at treasured photographs. As part of this section, we ask you to support the person to think about what they have already done to cope with grief. If the person you are supporting highlights they didn't do some of the coping strategies listed, make sure to discuss whether they'd like to do any of them in the future and plan ways and times this can be done. In this section, we wanted to highlight to people with learning disabilities that there are different beliefs about what happens to people after death. Whilst we don't talk about every religious belief in this section, we do briefly explain that some people believe in heaven, some people believe in reincarnation, and some people believe that nothing happens after death. If you would like to share any other beliefs in this section, please do so as appropriate for the individual that you support. We know that often people want to protect people with learning disabilities from grief, and so instead of saying someone has died, a number of different phrases might get used. In this section, we wanted to explain the different phrases people use for saying someone has died and support you to help the person with learning disabilities to understand that they all mean the same thing, and it's always best to be honest with the person so that they can fully understand and process the loss. Thank you for listening, and we hope that this workbook was helpful.